Hello, I'm Steve Young, and welcome to GM Steering Columns, the Inside Story. In this tape, you'll learn how to disassemble, remove the lock, and reassemble all four of the common GM steering columns. Those columns are the standard column, the tilt column, the tilt telescoping column, and the square-bodied column found on the Beretta and other new cars. The process of making keys for GM locks will be discussed in GM Locks, the Inside Story. However, most GM ignition locks have the code stamped on the outside of the lock, and the key can be easily made once the lock has been removed from the column. Or if you wish, you can replace the lock. Any parts of the job which are the same for each column, such as removing the steering wheel itself, will not be repeated. As we go along, be prepared to pause or rewind your VCR until you have learned each technique. A thorough understanding of these steering columns is vital to any locksmith who plans to do any automotive work. Before we go on to the columns, let's discuss the tools that you'll need in order to do the job. The wheel puller. This is the basic tool for steering column work. This tool removes the wheel from the column itself. The bolts, which are different for different types of cars, are attached to the wheel, and the central shaft of the puller is tightened against the steering column. Removal of the wheel without a puller is almost impossible. When you buy a wheel puller, be sure to buy a high-quality tool. Cheap wheel pullers simply will not hold up under regular usage. A good wheel puller will last for many years. An automotive supply house is probably your best source for a good wheel puller. The GM compression tool. This tool is used to compress the spring beneath the steering wheel locking plate. Without this tool, removal of the clip which holds the locking plate in place is very difficult, but not impossible. In this tape, you will see how to do the job both with and without this tool. I think you'll agree that the purchase of one of these tools is money well spent. This tool is available from automotive parts stores as well as locksmith supply houses. This is a homemade compression tool. This tool has been made from the spacer sleeve which is found on old Schlage latches. The sleeve has been bent so that the edges meet. Brazing or soldering the joint will make the tool last longer, but it's not necessary. The sleeves on current latches are much thinner than the old ones and will not work. This tool can also be made from a piece of tubing which is 1 inch long and has an inside diameter of 3/4 of an inch. The usage of this tool will be illustrated shortly. The telescoping wheel compression tool. This tool does the same job as the other compression tools except on a telescoping wheel column. On these columns, the shaft must be kept from telescoping while the plate is being compressed. The central shaft of this tool locks the column in place while the spring is compressed. This is a specialty tool and can be purchased from most locksmith supply houses. This is the TechTrain 3000 GM compression tool. This tool is designed to compress the spring and remove the clip from the new square-bodied columns found on the Beretta and the Corsica. This tool can also be used to compress the spring and remove the clip on the standard GM steering columns, with the exception of the telescoping column. This completes a section on tools. Now let's see how these tools are used on the simplest column. This is the original General Motors locking steering column. With all of these columns, the first step is the removal of the horn. The horn can be attached in a variety of different manners, but the majority of them can be removed by removing 2 or 4 screws on the back side of the steering wheel itself. Once the horn button has been released, then the electrical connection between the horn and the steering column itself must be removed. This is usually a small plastic tube which is spring-loaded. You must press in on the tube and turn it counterclockwise to release. Next, remove the spring clip on the end of the steering column itself. This is done with a pair of snap ring pliers. This is not present on some of the very earliest columns. The next step is the removal of the nut which holds the wheel onto the steering column. The older columns use a 7/8 inch nut and the new ones use a 13/16. Once the nut has been removed, you'll notice a small mark scribed onto the column and another mark scribed onto the steering wheel. These should line up with each other. This is your index mark to allow you to put the steering wheel back on in the same position that it came off. If the mark does not line up, make sure that you put the wheel on the same way it came off. Next, attach the steering wheel puller to the steering wheel itself. Insert one of the appropriate size bolts into one of the 2 threaded holes in the steering wheel. Then insert one leg of the wheel puller underneath that bolt, Make sure that the central shaft of the puller is against the column and insert your second bolt. Tighten these bolts evenly. If the bolts aren't even, you'll bend the bolts as you tighten the wheel puller. It's not unusual to have to strike the center of the wheel puller with a hammer in order to remove stubborn wheels. You can see this wheel puller has been very well used. Removing the wheel is the same procedure for all of the GM steering columns. Once the puller has been tightened, bring in an open-end wrench and tighten the central shaft of your puller until the wheel has been released from the splines of the steering column. After the wheel is released, leave the wheel puller attached to the wheel and simply lift the steering wheel off of the splines. The next step is the compression of the spring underneath the steering wheel locking plate. Bring the compression tool in and thread it onto the shaft of the steering column finger tight. Then snug the nut down around the compression tool. After the compression tool has been attached to the steering column, it's tightened by tightening the large nut on the top. Use an open-end wrench for this. The plate does not have to be compressed very far. The spring that is under the plate is very powerful. Once the plate has been compressed, use an ice pick or a similar tool to remove the spring clip, which is at the base of the column there. Lift one end of the clip with the ice pick while holding the side with a screwdriver. After one end has been released, walk the screwdriver around the edge to release the spring clip from its socket. Now that the spring clip has been removed from its socket, the compression tool can be released. Loosen the nut in order to do this and remove the tool itself. The plastic cover plate over top of the steering wheel locking plate is found only on the later steering columns. The early steering columns have a metal plate over it, which is attached with 3 screws. This plate does not have to be removed on either column. Now that the compression tool has been removed from the column, the spring clip can be slid up over the end of the steering column itself. Simply slide it over the splines and remove it. The next piece to be removed is the steering column locking plate. This is splined onto the shaft and will only fit in one direction. Gentle prying around the edge may be necessary to remove it. Note the splines around the center. The plate can only be installed in one way. The next piece to be removed is the turn signal canceling cam, which also carries current to the horn. Next, remove the knob on the emergency flashers. This particular column has a cap over the end of the knob. Most of them have the screw exposed. Unscrew the screw and remove the knob. Next, we'll be releasing the turn signal lever and the turn signal switch itself. These screws are Phillips head on this column, but the newer columns use Torx screws. Remove the turn signal lever first. On the models which have cruise control, there will be a wire which will go inside the steering column here. Simply pull the lever to the side and leave it hanging by the wire. The next step is to remove the turn signal switch itself. This is an all-plastic switch and is very fragile. Be certain that when you retighten the screws that you don't over-tighten them. The springs that you see at the top and the bottom of the switch are responsible for turning the turn signal off after the turn has been completed. These springs very often break. They're very inexpensive parts, and it's a good idea to keep a few of them in your toolbox. If you come across a broken one, you can make a customer very happy by replacing this simple part. These screws are Phillips head screws. On the newer columns, the screws have been replaced with Torx headed screws. I've found that it's best not to try to remove these screws while the switch is in place. After the switch has been loosened, pull the switch up out of the column and the screws will be carried along with the switch. Once it is safely outside the column, push the screws out. This way you can't possibly drop a screw down inside the column. It is open there at the bottom where the wires go down. You can lose a screw. Swing the switch out of the way and you're ready to remove the lock. Before the lock can be removed, the buzzer switch must be removed. Use a paper clip which has been bent into a hook, insert it underneath the spring that's attached to the buzzer switch. Pull the buzzer switch straight up out of its socket. The paper clip is necessary because the spring will become disconnected from the switch and fall inside the column. The retainer for the ignition lock is located at the bottom of this blind hole in the casting of the steering column. The metal at the bottom of this hole is paper thin and will punch a hole through it with the end of a small screwdriver. After the screwdriver has been inserted into the slot, hit the screwdriver with the palm of your hand. This will punch through and push down on the retainer, releasing the lock. Sometimes it's necessary to hit the screwdriver more than once in order to depress the retainer. Pull out on the lock and it's released. Here you see the retainer which held the lock in place. This is simply spring-loaded. Pushing down on it releases the lock. The column can be reassembled and then the lock replaced after the entire column has been reassembled. The code number is usually found stamped on the opposite side of the lock. Reassembling the column is the exact reverse of the disassembly. Insert your buzzer switch, making sure that it seats all the way home. Slide the turn signal switch back into place. There are molded depressions in the casting of the column that this will fit into. You'll feel it snap into place. Then install your screws, which hold the turn signal switch in place. After all three screws are in place, go around and snug each screw down so that they're evenly tightened. Make sure that you don't over tighten these screws and that the turn signal switch is sitting in its correct position. Next, reinstall the emergency flasher control knob. This knob has a post which must seat into the switch. Most of them do not have the cap over them that this one has. Snap the cap back in place and then the next step is to reinstall the turn signal lever. Simply slide the turn signal into its position, insert the screw, and tighten it. Again, if there had been cruise control, the turn signal lever would have been hanging there by its wire. Make sure that the wire is not pinched when you tighten the lever in place. Test the switch to make sure it works. Now we're ready to reinstall the turn signal canceling cam. Simply slide it over the column. Next, we're ready for the steering wheel locking plate. Remember that this plate is splined and will only go on one way. The flat there must line up with the flat on the side of the steering column. In addition, the post on the horn assembly must slide through the locking plate. Do not force this part. It will slip easily into place once it's properly aligned. Now slide your snap ring over top of the steering column. Place it over the splines. The column won't move like that if the column is installed in the car. The only reason this one moved was because the column had been removed from the car. Once the snap ring has cleared the splines, you can reinstall the compression tool. Install the end of the compression tool over the end of the steering column and tighten it down until it's finger tight. Make sure that the legs of the compression tool are centered on the locking plate. The plate has not engaged with the lock yet, so it will still turn. Hold it straight with your hand and tighten the nut until the locking plate has been compressed onto the spring and you can see the slot that the snap clip has to sit into. Now that the spring has been compressed, we need to move the snap ring down the column and seat it into its groove. Use the tip of an ice pick and a screwdriver in conjunction to move the clip slowly down the splines. Once it has come up over the edge of the splines, it will slide into place quite easily. The TechTrain 3000 compression tool can be used on this type of column as well as the square-bodied columns found on the Beretta and the Corsica, which will be shown later. Once the compression tool has been completely removed, check to make sure that the snap clip is completely seated. Do this by placing the end of a screwdriver against the clip and tapping lightly with your hand. We're now ready to reinstall the steering wheel. Make sure that the mark scribed onto the steering column and the mark on the steering wheel are aligned, or that it is offset the same amount as it was when you took it off. Make sure that the horn assembly protrudes through its hole in the wheel, and the wheel will seat smoothly. Now reinstall the nut. This nut must be tightened securely. This will lock the steering wheel onto the splines solidly. The older columns use a 7/8 inch nut, and the newer columns use a 13/16 nut. After the nut has been completely seated, do not forget to reinstall the snap ring, which goes over the end of the steering column. This snap ring is there in case the nut should come loose in order to keep the wheel from coming off the column. Use a snap ring plier to spread the clip, lock it into place. Next, reinstall the horn by placing the spring-loaded end of the connection into the hole, pressing in against the spring tension and twisting it clockwise to lock it into place. After this is firmly seated, Reinstall the horn button, and you're ready to insert the lock. This is a tilt steering column out of a late model General Motors car. The steering wheel lock plate, and the emergency flasher knob have already been removed. They're removed the same as on the other ones. This one has a link between the turn signal lever and the turn signal switch itself. Pull the link out. Be careful where you put it. The end is very greasy. The turn signal switch is removed exactly like it was on the other column. The 3 screws are all that holds it in place. Because of the angle on this column, we're removing the screws as we go to keep them from falling out. Be very careful with these screws. Because of the channel that the wires travel down inside the column, it is possible to lose one of the screws inside the column and never be able to retrieve it. Once the screws have been released, the switch will slide straight up out of the column and over the end of the steering column itself. Watch the screws. Pull straight out, up, and over. The buzzer switch on these models must be removed. The white plastic tab on the side of the switch hides the retaining screw that holds the lock into the steering column. Hook the spring on the buzzer with your paper clip and pull the buzzer switch out. If you don't use a paper clip, the spring will be left behind and can fall inside the steering column and be lost. The retaining screw on this one is a Phillips head. Later model ones will be Torx. Once the screw has been released, there is nothing holding the lock in place. This is a very strangely shaped screw, so be careful that you don't lose it once you get it out. Once the screw has been removed, there's nothing holding the lock in place. Note the shape of the screw. Pull the lock out, and see the slot there is where the retaining screw sits to hold the lock in place, just like that. The code will be stamped on the side of the lock, and the key can be made very easily. Once the key has been made to the ignition lock, reinsert the ignition lock the same way that it came out. Then insert the retaining screw and tighten securely. Do not try to reassemble the steering column with the key in place. If the lock is turned slightly, you can get things out of time and cause yourself a lot of trouble. Once the lock is securely in place, we need to reinstall the buzzer switch. This buzzer switch, if left out, will keep the buzzer from working. Many customers would prefer that you left the switch out. Insert the switch with the opening up and the contacts pointing to the upper left. Slide it into place carefully. Do not force it. It's very fragile and will break. Once it is firmly seated, we can then install the turn signal switch. Bring the turn signal switch up and over the end of the steering column and work the wires down into their channel in the steering column. You'll feel the switch snap into its proper position. Do not force it. Insert the 3 screws and tighten. After the 3rd screw has been inserted and tightened, go around and recheck all 3 of your screws and make sure that they're firm but not too tight. You do not want to crack this switch. Next, reinsert the linkage between the turn signal lever and the turn signal switch. Notice the greasy end. Slide it into its socket, lift the handle, and seat the end of the link into the switch. This will fit very easily when it's in the right place. Do not force it. Insert the screw and tighten securely. Do not over-tighten. Remember, this is plastic and you can strip it out easily or crack it if you over-tighten it. Once the link is properly inserted, test it to make sure that it works properly. The emergency flasher button on the later model cars is a 2-piece unit, but other than that it's reassembled exactly the same way as the other one. Make sure your post lines up with the switch and tighten the screw. The rest of the reassembly is the same as with the other column. This next illustration is how to remove the snap ring and the steering wheel locking plate without a compression tool. Take an ice pick or a scratch awl and lift the end of the spring clip. Insert a screwdriver under the end, and with the ice pick and the screwdriver slowly work your way around the clip until you've removed it from its socket. The paint will peel off of this dust cover. There's nothing that can be done about it. Just scrape it off once it's outside the car. lift the ring out of its socket, slowly working your way around. Once the clip has been removed, the plate will spring forward about 1/8 of an inch because of the spring tension behind it. It will not come all the way off. Pop the end of the clip loose and the plate will be free. There you go. Now remove the clip from the column. It will be a little bit bent, but it can be easily straightened back out. Just bend it until the tip ends touch. Now lift the locking plate off the column, and next is the turn signal canceling cam, and below that is the spring that you've been fighting all along. This is a pretty stout spring. Now we'll show the reassembly method without a compression tool. After the steering wheel locking plate has been seated onto the shaft, bring in your spring clip, which we have straightened back out. Simply bend the ends together, slide it over top of the splines, and get it started onto the second set of splines, which holds the steering wheel locking plate in place. You will have to compress the spring slightly in order to get the snap ring started over the second set of splines. Start one corner of the spring and bring in a second screwdriver and work it around until the snap ring snaps over the edge of the second set of splines. At this point, bring in your homemade compression tool. This tool is 1 inch long and has a 3/4 inch inside diameter. Slide the tool over the column, hold down on the spring clip, and start your nut in place on the end of the column. Once this is finger tight, you can release pressure on the spring. Bring in a wrench and tighten the nut until the snap ring snaps into place. The 1 inch length of the tube is exactly what you need. Run the nut down until it won't turn any further. At this point, you should hear a click as the spring clip snaps into its slot. If you don't, rock the column from side to side slightly and it will snap into place. Take a screwdriver and tap the spring clip to make sure that it is properly seated. Now you can release the pressure on the compression tool, loosen the nut, and remove your compression tool. After the compression tool is out of the way, bring in a screwdriver and tap the snap ring again to make sure that it is completely seated into its groove. We'll do this just as we did before. Place a screwdriver on the clip and tap it with your hand. The rest of the job is done just like with the other column. This next steering column is a tilt telescoping column. This particular column is actually out of a Chrysler product. Note that the horn is slightly different than the ones we've been seeing. This one just snaps in place. The Chrysler tilt telescoping steering columns are actually General Motors columns. The same is true for American Motors. All of the American Motors columns are the same as General Motors columns. Once the horn has been removed, you can see the telescoping mechanism, which allows the wheel to move up and down. The next thing we need to do is to remove the handle from the telescope control arm. There's a clip on the back. Push it down and slide the handle off. The 3 screws on that central plate hold the telescope control arm onto the telescope control. Remove those 3 screws. The screws will leave marks behind on the plate showing where they were tightened. If you cannot see any marks, then circle the heads of the screws on the plate so that you can reassemble the plate to the arm as close as possible to the same position they were in before you disassembled it. After the 3rd screw has been released, the control arm will hang freely below the steering wheel. At this point, you need to unscrew the control plate. This has a shaft on it which is threaded and extends down into the center of the steering column. The end of that shaft presses against another shaft, and when it is tightened all the way, locks the steering wheel into place. If it is loosened even a 1/4 of a turn, the steering wheel is allowed to move up and down on its column. After the control plate has been removed, the control arm can then be removed from the wheel itself. It will simply slide through the slot. Note the threaded shaft. Now grasp the control arm and slide it out through the steering wheel. The rest of the disassembly of the steering wheel is just like any other GM steering wheel. After the wheel has been loosened from the shaft, simply pull it off as with any other GM wheel. However, on the back of the wheel is a large spring. This spring is responsible for carrying current from the horn button to the horn assembly inside the column. There is a nylon retainer that the end of this spring sits into on top of the column. Let's pause for a moment and discuss that retainer. Unfortunately, this is the way you'll see a lot of these retainers. They get brittle with age, and when you try to remove them, they break in two. This can really ruin your day if you don't have a replacement. This piece is essential. Without it, the horn blows continuously. This is a new retainer. It costs $2.85. If you're smart, you'll keep one of these in your truck. It can save you hundreds of dollars worth of aggravation. The GM part number is included with the paperwork that came with your tape. And now let's pick up where we left off. Notice how the column moves up and down without the control in place. Remove the rubber washer and you're ready to carefully remove the retainer. The retainer is removed very carefully by inserting a screwdriver into the slot and prying gently up on each ear individually. Once the first ear is lifted, hold your finger under it to keep it from snapping back down. Work your way around the retainer until all 5 of the ears are released. Carefully pull the retainer off, and if you haven't broken it, you're in good shape. Beneath the retainer is a horseshoe-shaped clip which holds the steering wheel locking plate to the steering column. We'll be using the telescoping wheel compression tool to remove this clip. Screw the central shaft of the tool into the steering column. The shaft must be tightened securely in order to lock the steering column into place. Screw the shaft in till it's finger tight, then bring in a wrench and tighten the shaft securely. If this is not done, the steering column will telescope as you tighten the compression tool, and the net result will be 0. Screw the nut down snug against the compression tool and then tighten it with a wrench. As you tighten the compression tool, you'll see the steering wheel locking plate move downward. You want to compress the spring just enough to allow you to remove the horseshoe clip easily. Do not over-tighten. After the plate has been compressed, the horseshoe-shaped clip should slide off easily. You may have to help it occasionally with a screwdriver. This clip has a definite top and bottom. The bottom side has a scooped-out edge. Make sure that the clip is installed the same way that it came off. After the clip has been removed, the tension can be released from the compression tool. Do this by unscrewing the nut and then releasing the central shaft. As you relieve tension on the spring, you'll see the steering wheel lock plate move upwards. This will release the steering wheel lock, so when you turn the central shaft, the wheel will have a tendency to turn. Hold it tight and then unscrew the shaft. After the tool has been removed, the steering wheel locking plate can then be lifted straight out of the housing of the steering column. Simply reach into the steering column and grasp the steering wheel lock plate by the gaps around the edge and lift it out. Notice that this plate has a distinct top and bottom. The bottom is smooth and the top has a lip. Be sure to reinstall it correctly. The turn signal canceling cam now lifts straight off. Notice that it has a flat on one side, which aligns with a flat on the steering column. The turn signal assembly is removed exactly the same as it was in the other cars. Simply release the screw holding the turn signal arm and remove the arm out of the side. That little plastic clip around the turn signal arm simply snaps into the side of the steering column. Remove the screws from the turn signal switch. Again, we're leaving the screws in place until we pull the switch out of the column and then removing the screws. After the third screw has been removed, we'll lift the turn signal switch up and over the end of the steering column and then remove the screws. As you lift the switch out, make sure that the little springs attached to the turn signal do not get caught on the spring around the column. This is a good way to lose one of these springs. Pull the switch out and flip the screws out into your hand so they can't get lost. This is an old style column and has the spring-loaded retainer. This one is visible from the top. You can see it there above the buzzer switch. Had it been a late model column, there would have been a screw retainer underneath the tab on the buzzer switch. Simply push down on the spring-loaded retainer with a screwdriver while pulling out on the lock to release this one. The other type, you would remove the screw and pull out. This is actually a General Motors lock which is just fitted up for a Chrysler key. The reassembly of this steering column is just like the others. Simply reinsert the turn signal assembly into its seat inside the column and reinstall the screws. Again, you'll feel the turn signal switch seat into its proper position once it's in. Watch out for that spring in the center hitting against the springs on the turn signal. Insert your screws and tighten. After the third screw has been tightened, go back and recheck all of your screws and make sure that they're tight but not too tight. Next, reinstall the emergency flasher knob. This is the standard type with a screw in the center. Line up the post on the knob with the switch. Make sure that it's tight but not overly tight. Check it to make sure it works. Next, reattach the turn signal arm. Notice that this one has cruise control. The wire that was holding it there is the cruise control connection. Tighten the screw in place, but do not over tighten it, and then check the turn signal switch to make sure that it operates smoothly. On this type of column, you'll need to snap the little insert back in on the side of the steering column. It snaps into place. Next, reinstall the turn signal canceling cam. Make sure that the flat aligns with the flat on the column. And then reinstall the steering wheel lock plate. Remember that the lip goes towards the top. Slide it in place. Next, we'll need to compress the spring underneath the steering wheel lock plate. We'll use the compression tool exactly the same as we did before. Tighten the central shaft until it bottoms out. However, this time you'll need to tighten it tighter than you can hold it by hand. Use a pair of vice grips or a pair of pliers on the steering column, being very careful not to damage the splines. Once the steering column is held firmly in place, then you can tighten the central shaft until the steering column will no longer telescope. Once the central shaft of the compression tool is tight, you can release the steering column. Now you're ready to actually compress the spring. Do this by tightening the nut on the outside of the compression tool. As you do this, watch and make sure that the steering wheel lock plate moves smoothly down the outer part of the steering column. If it binds, back up and start over again. Do not over tighten. Tighten it just far enough that the slot is visible for the horseshoe clip. Remember that the dished out portion of the horseshoe clip goes towards the bottom of the steering column. Simply slide the clip into its slot, and once the clip is in place, the tension on the spring can be relieved by removing the compression tool. Relieve the pressure on the spring by unscrewing the nut on the outside of the compression tool. Once this has been done, you can unscrew the central shaft. Once the tension has been relieved on the central shaft of the tool, the column is free to telescope once more. Continue to remove the tool, and if the column moves up and down, this is normal. Now the retainer simply snaps over top of the horseshoe clip. Press it down and push the ears down and it will lock into place. The rubber washer goes over the steering column next. Push it down flush against the retainer. Next, reinstall the steering wheel, making sure that the spring goes over the center of the retainer and makes good contact on the 3 brass contacts. Push the steering wheel down onto the splines, making sure that it is in the correct position, and it should seat easily. Next, tighten down the nut on the steering wheel and make sure that the steering wheel is properly tightened. This is the same on all wheels. After the steering wheel has been properly tightened, reinsert the telescoping control arm into the steering wheel. Next, screw the telescoping control shaft down into the steering column. Screw this down until it's good and tight. Once it's tight and the steering wheel will no longer telescope up and down, then you can line up the marks on the top plate with the screw holes through the control arm. Align the screw holes in the control arm with the marks on the plate and insert your screws. Do not tighten the screws until all 3 screws are in place, or you may not be able to get them to align properly. The normal operation of the telescoping wheel control is that when the handle is all the way to the left, the steering wheel is locked into place and will not move up and down. With the handle over towards the right, the wheel is free to move up and down. If, after everything is tightened up and the handle is in the far left position, the steering wheel will still move up and down, loosen these screws and move the handle towards the right and retighten them. Try that position. If that doesn't work, readjust it again until it works properly. After the screws are all snug, go around and tighten them up again to make sure that everything is good and tight. Now give it a final check to make sure that the wheel will telescope up and down freely. Next, reinstall the control knob. This simply slides onto the end of the control arm. And the last step is to properly reinstall the horn control. Once it is connected, this one just snaps back into place. The only thing unusual about the steering wheels on the new square-bodied GM columns is this vibration damper, which is located underneath the nut that holds the wheel on. Simply slide it off the column and pull the wheel in the normal fashion. After the wheel is off, the next step is to remove the turn signal canceling cam. Some of these are metal and some are plastic, but they'll all be very greasy, so be careful where you set them. Next, we need to remove the 3 screws which hold the turn signal switch in place. Notice that there is no steering wheel lock plate on this model. The steering column is locked further down inside the column. It will only lock in one position. The wheel will make a full revolution to that position before it locks. This car had been worked on previously, and one of the 3 screws that holds the turn signal in place had been stripped out and was missing. Normally it would be in this position right here. Next, we need to remove the single screw which holds the turn signal lever on. This is a very unusual setup on the turn signal lever. It is a Y-shaped fork that goes both above and below the turn signal. Make sure when you're reassembling it that this is seated properly. After this screw has been removed, and it's a long one, you can remove the outer housing of the steering column itself. Pull straight up. It may be necessary to tap it lightly with a rubber mallet to get it loose. Once it is released from the column, the turn signal arm will slip out from around the turn signal switch. Next, simply lift the turn signal switch over the shaft. This is the TechTrain 3000 compression tool. Simply slide it over the steering shaft and reinstall the nut that held the steering wheel on. Tighten the tool by hand. It's not necessary to use a wrench with this one. The spring is much lighter than on the older style columns. Now take a screwdriver and carefully pry one end of the snap ring out of its slot through one of the 3 openings in the side of the tool. This is the same type of snap ring that we saw on the earlier columns. Work your way around the tool through the 3 openings, prying the snap ring out of its slot as you go around. As you move your screwdriver from one opening to the next, take care that the snap ring does not slip back down the shaft and into its slot. After the ring is completely free of its slot, remove the compression tool. The spring will push the snap ring further up the steering shaft. When the tool is out of the way, simply grab the outside of the spring, pull straight up, and the snap ring will slide up the steering shaft. Here we have the snap ring, which is the same as what we've been seeing. This washer is different, however. It is rounded on the bottom and flat on the top. Always make sure that the flat edge goes up. And remove the spring. We're ready to move on. After removing the spring from the column, release the 3 Torx-headed screws which hold the housing onto the column itself. One of the screws on the left has already been removed from this column. After the 3 screws have been removed, we'll lift that entire casting, which you see moving there, straight up and over the steering column shaft. It is possible using a long, thin Torx screwdriver to reach the retainer which holds the lock in place without removing this housing. However, it is very awkward. There is a washer around the steering column which comes off with this housing. Be sure to catch it. This is the buzzer switch which obscures the retaining screw which holds the lock in place. Simply reach underneath it with any type of tool, pull straight out, and slide it to the side. There is no spring to get lost on this type of buzzer switch. Now we're ready to remove the retaining screw which holds the ignition lock into the column. This screw is just like the ones we saw in the previous columns. Simply unscrew it and the ignition lock will slide out of the column. The lock on this type of column is different than the lock we've been seeing, however. The sector gear, which was located inside the steering column on the previous ones, is attached permanently to the back of the lock on this one. After the problem with the ignition lock has been solved, then reinsert the lock into the housing without the key in place. Do not try to insert the lock with the key in and turned. It is possible to get the rack and pinion sector gear out of time. Once the lock has been reinstalled into the column, simply insert the retaining screw and tighten securely. Now slide the buzzer assembly back into its socket beneath the ignition lock, sliding it in until it seats firmly. After this has been done, slide the casting back over top of the steering shaft and slide it down until it seats. There are 3 Torx-headed screws which hold this in place. These screws must be tightened securely, but be careful that you don't over-tighten them. This was a rental car, and the steering column had been worked on before we got the car. The top left-hand screw had been stripped out before we got it. After these screws have been tightened, be sure to reinstall the thrust washer which was located around the steering column shaft. This is the one that came off with the casting. Slide it straight back onto the column, and then you're ready to reinstall the spring and the retainer. After the spring is in place, we need to bring in the flat washer, making sure that the rounded edge of the washer goes down and that the flat edge goes against the snap ring. Bring the snap ring in just as we did on the older columns. Slide it down over the steering shaft and push it down as far as you can against the flat washer. Notice the flat on the side of the steering shaft. This is there to align the turn signal canceling cam. Make sure that when you reinstall the snap ring, the opening of the snap ring is not on this flat. If it is, there is a possibility that the snap ring could come off during usage of the car. Bring the 3000 compression tool back into place. Tighten it down again by hand using the nut that held the steering wheel on. As you tighten the tool, periodically push the snap ring further down the steering shaft until it aligns with its slot. Once the tool has reached bottom, the slot will be fully exposed. Push the snap ring down and you will hear it snap into its slot. Again, make sure that the opening is not over the flat in the steering wheel. While the compression tool is tight against the spring, it will be easy to rotate the spring clip inside its slot until you have it in its proper position. The flat on the side of the compression tool is there for the old style steering columns. If it were not for this flat, there would not be enough room for the tool to fit between the steering shaft and the horn connection on the turn signal canceling cam. When the snap ring snaps solidly into its slot, simply unscrew the nut and remove the compression tool. After making sure that the snap ring has seated into its socket all the way around, we're ready to reinstall the turn signal switch. Now slide the turn signal switch back into place and bring the steering column cover back into place with the turn signal arm in its proper position. Make sure that the bottom fork of the turn signal arm engages properly with the dimmer switch. Be sure to test the dimmer switch before you return the car to the customer. It's very easy to install this incorrectly. Now, reinstall the screw which holds the turn signal lever into place on the turn signal switch. This is a self-locking screw and will be tight all the way in. Be sure to tighten it securely, but do not over-tighten it. Next, we can reinstall the 3 screws which hold the turn signal switch into position. Normally, the top 2 screws will be Torx-headed screws and the bottom one will be a Phillips head screw. The bottom screw was missing on this car. It had been stripped out. The top right-hand screw engages with a sheet metal tab which is attached to the housing over the turn signal switch. Once these screws have been retightened, we're ready to install the emergency flasher control knob. This is a different type of knob than we've been seeing on the other columns. This is an all-plastic lever which moves straight up and down. Be careful when tightening the screw that you don't get it cross-threaded or over-tighten it, because it is an all-plastic assembly. After this has been done, we're ready to reinstall the turn signal canceling cam. This will only go onto the shaft in one position. It has a flat on one side. Simply slide the cam back into place and we're ready to reinstall the steering wheel. Slide it back into place, making sure that your alignment marks are in the correct position, opposite each other. After the steering wheel is properly seated onto the splines, bring the vibration damper back into place and slide it over the shaft. The two posts go into the screw holes that we used earlier for the steering wheel puller. Not all of the square-bodied columns use a vibration damper. After the damper is in place, start the nut back onto the steering shaft and make certain that the vibration damper is properly seated. We can then tighten the steering wheel in the normal fashion and reinstall the horn, and the job will be complete. The square-bodied tilt columns are slightly different. The housing is not removed. This spring-loaded plunger is depressed and turned to the left in order to expose the retainer which holds the ignition lock into place. This will be very greasy, so be careful where you put it. Using a piece of wire bent into a hook, insert it into the hole and hook the wires which are attached to the buzzer switch. Once the wires have been hooked, simply pull straight up and the buzzer switch will slide out of its hole. Remove the tool, push the buzzer switch to the side with your torque screwdriver, unscrew the retaining screw which holds the ignition lock into place, and bring it back up through the hole. A magnetic screwdriver is very handy for this. Once the retaining screw has been removed, simply slide the ignition lock out of the side of the housing. The code number for the lock will be stamped on the side of the lock. The reassembly is the reverse of the disassembly. Be sure to install the lock with the key removed. Slide it back into place, seat it firmly into the column. Then reinsert the retaining screw, being careful not to drop it inside the column. Once the screw is in place, make sure that it threads in properly, tighten it securely, and then we're ready to reinstall the buzzer switch. Reinstalling the buzzer switch is quite a bit trickier than getting it out. It has a tendency to slide to one side. Make sure that it seats properly in its socket. Once it's properly seated, it will slide smoothly into place. Push straight down until it's seated. Now we're ready to reinstall the spring-loaded plunger, which goes over the retainer. Using a number 2 Phillips screwdriver, push it into place. Turning the plunger to the right will lock it into position. After this has been done, the rest of the reassembly is just as it was on the other column. That concludes GM Steering Columns, the Inside Story. I hope you've gained a lot of useful information from this tape. Stay tuned for scenes from several other Tech Train tapes. All Tech Train products are available direct from Tech Train at this address: Post Office Box 15401, Pensacola, Florida 32514. Our toll-free order line is 1-800-356-0136. And thank you for choosing Tech Train.
Opening the 88s, the inside story, is the most complete guide to car opening ever produced. In the first tape, on the domestic models, you will see how to open all of the 1988 GM, Ford, and Chrysler products. You will see them all. Starting with the Cadillac Alonze, you will see the Corvette, the Chevrolet Beretta, the Camaro, the S10s, the Cadillac Seville, the Chevrolet van, the Ford Taurus, the Thunderbird, the Lincoln Town Car, Dodge Dakota, Chrysler LeBaron, and the Plymouth Voyager, in addition to all the other models. The reason we call it the inside story is that we take you inside the door panel and show you exactly what the tool does inside the door. Knowing what is inside the door takes the guesswork out of car opening. Owning these tapes is almost like having X-ray vision. You will see where the guards are located and how to get around them. Each scene is clear and sharp, with nothing left to the imagination. TechTrain uses only broadcast quality video equipment for the best possible image. Don't settle for blurry, out-of-focus videos when you can have TechTrain quality. A running narration guides you through each step of the opening procedure, and a pocket-sized quick reference guide is included with each tape so that you can refresh your memory while on the job. In the second tape, Imports Volume 1, you will learn how to open 46 of the most common 1988 imports. You will learn how to open all of the Nissans, including the 300ZX, all of the Toyotas, including the Supra and Celica, all of the Hondas, all of the Mazdas, all of the Subarus, all of the Volkswagens, all of the Audis, and the Yugo. Once again, you will see the inside of each door. You will clearly see which parts of the linkage to attack and which way to move them. The clarity of the images will astound you. Only TechTrain gives you such amazing detail. With these tapes, you can approach any lockout with confidence because you will know what is inside the door. Why waste time guessing when you can know where everything is and how it works? You can train all of your employees in the comfort of your own shop. Never again will one of your customers have to watch you figure out how to open their car. For those who prefer to pick the car open, the quick reference guide gives you the direction of turn for each model so that you can always pick the lock in the right direction the first time. TechTrain tapes are made by locksmiths for locksmiths. Every step of the production process, from the camera work to the final editing in the studio, is done by a professional locksmith. In the third tape, Imports Volume 2, you will see how to open some of the most challenging cars of the 1988 model year. You will learn how to open the Acuras, the Alfa Romeo Milano, the BMW 300 and 500 series, all of the Hyundais, all of the Isuzus, the Medallion, the Mercedes, the Mercures, all of the Mitsubishis, the Peugeot 505, the Porsche 924, 944, and 928, the Saab 900 and 9000, and the Volvo 240 and 700 series. Again, you will see startling views of the inside of the door panels. In making these tapes, TechTrain disassembled over 100 different car doors. Now you can see the insides of these doors without having to leave your easy chair. Because you actually see inside the door, you will see how to use tools you already have to open these cars. You are not locked in to using certain tools. Instructions are even included for making your own tools for several cars, such as the Acuras and the Toyota Celica. In TechTrain's Car Opening Update Number 1, you will learn how to open all of the models which have changed for 1989, plus new models which have been introduced. You'll see the Buick Reatta, the Ford Probe, the Lincoln Continental, the Chrysler Acclaim, the Plymouth Laser, the Porsche 911, the Nissan Access and 240SX, the Mazda MPV, and more. In addition to the new cars, you'll see new ways of opening the Chevrolet Astro, the four-door Cavaliers, and the Ford LTDs. You will also see some selected older cars, such as the '69 Corvette, '84 BMW 745i, 72 Porsche 914, and others. Tech Train once again takes you inside the door with clear, sharp views of the linkages and guards. These tapes take the guesswork out of car opening. Let Tech Train and the Locksmith Ledger increase your profits by saving you valuable time on each lockout. Train all of your employees without having to leave your shop. Don't let the new cars lock you out. Cars are getting harder to open every year. You need to have the best information you can get if car opening is a part of your business. When you put the Locksmith Ledger and Tech Train Productions to work for you, you can't lose. You will get the most important thing a locksmith needs, self-confidence. You will approach each job with confidence because you will know what is inside the door. You will know just what to do to open the car quickly, easily, and without damage to the car. With Tech Train, the Locksmith Ledger, and a little self-confidence, you or any of your employees can handle the hardest lockout. If you know what's inside the door, you can open it. All you have to do is get the inside story. In Ford steering columns, the inside story, Tech Train continues its tradition of bringing the locksmith the best in video education. This tape, like all Tech Train tapes, carries the seal of approval of the Guild for Student and Apprentice Locksmiths. This is your assurance of quality in locksmith education. This tape will teach you how to remove and replace the lock in all of the common Ford steering columns. You will see 3 types of standard steering columns and 3 types of tilt wheel steering columns, including the airbag-equipped column used in the new Lincoln Continentals. You'll see how to remove the lock from all of the columns with or without the key. First, you'll learn how to use the key to remove both the pin tumbler and the new 10-cut sidebar locks. Then you will see in close-up detail exactly how to remove pin tumbler locks from each steering column by drilling. Next, you will see how to drill out the new sidebar Ford locks. You will see how to drill the standard style lock and the new round-faced lock which is used in the Continental, Taurus, and Sable. A special section of the tape will teach you how to make a key by impressioning for the pin tumbler locks. Once again, Tech Train brings you amazing close-up views as you are taken step by step through making a key by impression. The running narration describes each action as you see it on the screen, leaving nothing to the imagination. If you do automotive work, Ford steering columns, the inside story, needs to be in your video library. Airbag steering columns are now standard equipment on many of the new cars. In 1990, over 2.4 million cars equipped with airbags will be built in the United States. Every locksmith who does automotive work needs to learn about these new steering columns. In this tape, you will learn how to remove and replace the lock in all of the airbag-equipped cars made by Chrysler, GM, and Ford. You'll see both the Chrysler tilt wheel and the standard airbag-equipped columns. Tech Train guides you through removing and replacing the lock in each column with crystal clear close-ups while a running narration explains each step as you see it on the screen. After the Chrysler columns, you'll see the GM airbag-equipped columns. You'll see the modern column and a rare airbag column from 1974. Then you'll see the Lincoln Continental, which has both a driver's side and a passenger side airbag as standard equipment. A special bonus section covers the Canadian-made steering column, which is used only in the Cadillac Seville. This is not an airbag-equipped column, but it is an unusual column every locksmith should understand. The quick reference guide, which comes packed with each tape, explains how airbag systems work and the precautions that need to be taken whenever you work on one of these steering columns. Don't be left behind. These steering columns are here now. Today's automotive locksmith must learn to work on them. This video is the locksmith's most complete guide to airbag steering columns.